What's going on, everyone? It's Chris here from Friendly Frenzy Games. Welcome back to another episode of One More Run for Slay the Spire 2. Today, we'll see how this block and powers based build stacks up in Ascension 2 against some additional elite spawns and 20% less missing HP heals from the Ancients. Now, choosing Neow's bones for 2 random relics at the start of my run, then securing the Juggernaut power card as my rare reward after using the Arcane Scroll relic really paved the way for the larger strategy of this build and ultimately framed how I would choose my rewards to have the best chance of climbing the Spire. Now, building around Juggernaut at the helm of the deck, the overall strategy would really be to weaponize some block-centered cards to become versatile attacks. This helps to create some aggressive turns while piloting an otherwise pretty passive deck, since the ultimate goal is to really collect and play some block cards to protect your hit points against the increasingly difficult challenges thrown your way. Picking up at the second map node, I visit the merchant and purchase the oddly smooth stone relic, which boosts the effectiveness of all block cards by 1 during combat. I was also able to afford one of my favorite Ironclad cards, Armaments. Now, this isn't super great out of the gate, but when it's upgraded, it does grant block and upgrades the effectiveness of all cards in hand for the rest of combat. To me, this is a must-add for any and all Ironclad builds. On floor 6, right after the fight with Inhibit, I lock down another Armaments card reward to increase the chances that I pull one when I need it, and on floor 7, I visit my first rest site to upgrade one of my Armaments to get this online as soon as I'm able. I grab the Iron Wave card reward after my elite fight with Burdonis as a great option to firstly grant some block, but then to also deal damage at the same time. Casting this with Juggernaut already out feels absolutely great because it's going to essentially hit for some damage twice. Now, the following floor, I'm greeted with an unknown node, which reveals itself as the self-help book event. I choose to enchant my newly upgraded Armaments card with Nimble 2 to increase the amount of block that it grants on cast. Shortly after this, I wipe the floor with the Bygone Effigy Elite and secure yet another card that I hold in high regard, especially for this strategy called Flame Barrier. On cast, it's going to drop a huge amount of block, but then it's also going to deal chip damage to attackers. This is obviously super helpful against those attackers who are swinging multiple times in a single turn. Now, we're already at the rest site that's just before the Act 1 boss, and honestly, I'm feeling pretty confident while nearly at full health. I decide to upgrade my second Armaments again just as a way to increase the likelihood here that I pull one of these early on in combat to again boost the effectiveness of all other cards for the duration of the fight as soon as possible. So I'm all set to square off against the Kin Priest and its followers as the first real test to see how this build is shaping up. An upgraded Armaments in turn 1 turns Flame Barrier into an absolute beast for the rest of combat, and in turn 2, I'm able to get Juggernaut online. Now, Juggernaut is working as intended, but one of the biggest flaws is already made apparent right away. Dealing damage to random enemies is a huge drawback in fights where there's multiple opponents, making it much more difficult to eliminate some incoming damage off the board. Now, I was defending pretty well, but the fight lasted way too long and there were too many enemies remaining. They were only getting stronger. I likely should have focused my attacks a little bit more when I did play them on the Kin followers first, but since I didn't, I ended up taking a lot more damage in this fight than I needed to by the time that I actually passed this test. As luck would have it, I did collect a second Juggernaut here, which again increases my odds of getting the entire strategy online earlier, but then also, if it is played later, Juggernaut's actually going to stack and deal damage twice for each time block is gained. Now, at the start of Act 2, Payal gives me a few solid Ancient Relic options for block-based builds, but ultimately I choose to take Payal's Flesh for some additional energy each combat starting in turn 3 and onwards. This is going to allow me to play some more cards, build more block, and deal more damage as fights go longer, while understanding I'm likely not winning in these first 2 turns anyways. I choose the Evil Eye card reward after my battle with the Bullbugs, as this thing will definitely pull its weight. At its worst, it's an upgraded defend card, but since there's so many status and curse cards that use the exhaust mechanic, even without an exhaust build, it can sneakily trigger twice to double the block gained quite effortlessly. I visit the merchant for the first time in a while and purchase Unmovable to double the block gain from the first card that I play each turn. Although this doesn't grant block itself to trigger Juggernaut, it does dramatically improve defenses to deal with large threats in a pinch. In a later unknown node, I'm met by the Spirit Grafter event, and in hindsight, I wrongly choose to upgrade Unmovable to decrease its casting cost. The better option definitely would have been to upgrade one of the two Juggernauts to increase their damage dealt. Now I do struggle mightily with my next few fights against multiple opponents, with all of it coming to a head against the Decimillipede Elite. I go in with less than half health, and it isn't until turn 3 that I'm able to actually get my strategy online. I have a very good turn 4 with a massive amount of block built up, but that really doesn't leave me much to draw in later turns, and I'm all but wiped off the face of the earth in turn 5. However, the Fairy in a Bottle potion procs and revives me while restoring some HP, and I live to fight another day. Now I definitely still face a huge challenge though, but managed to draw into a second Juggernaut to hyperdrive my damage. I very luckily draw into enough block to deal enough damage to the stomach and rear before the head regrows and end up narrowly escaping a second death. I grab the Gorget relic, which basically grants diminishing block for the first 4 turns of every combat, and also a second Evil Eye card reward as I realize that I'm still needing some more block cards to play when I've got at least one Juggernaut set up. I visit yet another merchant, all while knowing that yet another elite looms on the next floor before I'm able to truly revitalize. I do make some short-sighted purchases here, like the Red Skull relic to boost my damage while under 50% health, which currently I was, but then there's also the Belt Buckle relic, which would boost the effectiveness of my block cards by 2 for the entirety of combat so long as I wasn't carrying any potions. Now this was a great trade for me. Not so luckily though, the Infested Prism greets me on the elite floor and penalizes you for playing skills. Now this is essentially all of my block cards. However though, with Juggernaut online turn 2 and then again in turn 4, coupled with all of my block stacks accumulating faster than its frailty debuff, I skate through relatively unharmed and definitely enough to heal at the rest site just before the Act 2 boss. After skipping plenty of card rewards in Act 2 and making what feels like really only some small adjustments, I'm faced with the next test to see how the build is shaping up against the Crusher and Rocket Crab Claws. Yet another fight with some multiple enemies. Now since these pincers do huge damage very quickly, the first few turns really just became about mitigating as much damage as possible. Ultimately, drawing Unmovable turn 2 was very helpful for that. Juggernaut was online by the end of turn 4, which set me up to do some chip damage while deflecting as much damage as possible. By turn 8, I had drawn into my second Juggernaut, which really helped me get some damage online. Even with that though, it was a balancing act between dealing damage and blocking enough to survive. As the fight crept into turn 14, I was able to finally best the second of the 2 Crab Claws, and it's here that I grabbed the Crimson Mantle power card. Now this will ensure that I have a guaranteed way to generate some block at the start of every turn after it's been played, which is obviously also a fantastic automatic trigger for Juggernaut as well. Now I grab the Fiddle Ancient Relic at the start of Act 3 in hopes that it's going to allow me to draw out my strategy cards earlier in the game, and then the drawback of no other cards being drawn really isn't that much of a drawback, since at this point I don't have any cards that are actually contributing to drawing cards, so it doesn't actually turn anything off. During my first fight in Act 3 with the Devoted Sculptor, I realized that some of my block numbers are getting pretty large. Now as a card reward, I snag an already upgraded Body Slam, which is the perfect damage dealing haymaker in this deck because it allows me to accumulate a huge turn of block, then cast the card for free to deal some damage equal to that amount of block that I currently have. Then I visit the merchant and purchase Fisticuffs. Now this is going to essentially function like Iron Wave in that it deals damage and grants blocks on a single cast, though the block does scale with the amount of damage that's done by the card. Now since I'm not a damage focused build though, it's almost irrelevant, but it is another solid way to do 2 things at once here. I quickly obliterate my first elite in Act 3, the Mecha Knight, wrapping it up with a nice bow using my new Body Slam finisher, and then I finally upgraded one of the 2 Juggernauts at the nearby rest site to increase the amount of damage that it's going to deal for each block that's played. I popped into my next elite fight of Act 3, this time against the trio of knights. Now this was a pretty good test to get an idea of how the build was working together now, since clearly I've had many issues in previous fights against multiple enemies. For this specific fight though, I had my entire game plan set up and on the board by the end of turn 2, and it was amplified by dropping the second Juggernaut in turn 4. All said, the deck finally seemed like things were where they needed to be, as I cleaned up 3 enemies relatively quickly and without losing almost any damage myself. I was feeling pretty ready for the end at this point. Before we got there though, I grabbed the upgraded Shrug It Off as a card reward for the block and card draw, but that probably wasn't necessary since the Fiddle Relic was going to turn off the card draw for this anyways. But still, 1 card and 11 block, that could definitely be much worse. I arrive at the final rest site of the run, only 2 HP away from maximum health, so I thought I might as well upgrade Crimson Mantle so that it grants me even more block per turn than intended after it's been played. Now it all comes down to this, my fight with test subject C16. I draw a very good opening hand that allows me to get some of my setup, Juggernaut and Crimson Mantle online very early, and I'm also able to play enough block to thwart its opening attack. I'm even able to throw out a chunk of damage at the end with Body Slam. Turn 2, I get another piece of the puzzle, Unmovable. This is going to again double the effectiveness of the first block card that I play each turn, and Armaments is bumping the efficiency of the base cards in my hand for the rest of combat. Playing this also dealt enough damage to spawn back the test subject, but even stronger. Now that test subject C16 has grown a second head, there was no greater time for me to have drawn into my second head, the upgraded Juggernaut. Flame Barrier puts in work over these next 2 turns as test subject swings multiple times, taking a bunch of chip damage with each attack. And yet again, I'm able to draw into a bunch of blocks that damage test subject, just enough to respawn him into its final form. The intangible stacks definitely make it hard to get any damage through here, but luckily I don't really have to pivot my game plan. I'm literally just stacking blocks to be able to eat attacks. Sadly though, the turn after the intangible stacks drop, I draw what seems to be all of my pure attack cards all at once. Yet I do still manage to deplete half of its health on a single turn before it hides behind its Iron Curtain. Yet again, the stacks drop and I draw nearly all of my attacks for the second time in a row. I'm still able to get test subject to within range of death, and it is very nearly killing itself on my thorns as we speak. But as luck would have it, even with the intangible stacks up, I happen to draw enough blocks to sneak 3 damage by to score the ultimate victory while having only lost a few hit points in the process. So there you have it, my very first Ironclad Ascension 2 victory in Slay the Spire 2 version 107. I hope that you enjoyed the video. If you did, be sure to leave a comment, give it a like, and drop some hype, and I will see you in the next episode of One More Run.